Welcome back to the last part of the Middle East and North Africa as a region. We're going to talk about a couple of unique countries there and some of the economics and a little bit about politics in the region, and then we're going to wrap up this region. So first we're going to start with Iran, which has definitely appeared in our news as of recently. It is important to note that Iran is not an Arab country. Um, unlike many other countries in the region, excuse me, it is a majority Shia Muslim and not Sunni Muslim. And so their military supports Shia causes. In 1953, it was democratic, wealthy, and quite liberal. And then the prime minister was ousted by the CIA, essentially for oil money. Um, and the Shah was reinstated, the former ruler. And in 1979, there was a revolution, um, and Islam United anti-Shah forces overthrew the Shah. And it was after that that really the country pretty dramatically changed and has been a theocracy ever since. Remember, a theocracy is a country where you have the government and religion intertwined. It is now nominally democratic, but certainly you can see in the top left there, um, back in the 50s and the 60s, it was quite socially liberal, as opposed to today. Like many other Muslim nations, there are codes for dress and things such as alcohol are illegal. They have nuclear ambitions, and those are seen as kind of a destabilizer in the region, and so we recently made it kind of a deal with them as part of the broader international community to monitor um, their nuclear weapons and ambitions, whether or not they're using them for power or for weaponry. But it looks like that deal might start to fall apart. So recent deal with the West, but it's a little bit precarious right now. So they experience relative prosperity, and again, they are somewhat democratic, and their stability as a nation is actually really important in the region. The other country that I wanted to talk about was Turkey, which is quite unique. Turkey is literally a bridge between the Middle East and Europe. Uh, there's a picture in the bottom left there of Istanbul, which I've been to, and you could literally be in Europe on one side of the Bosphorus River and Asia on the other side. Um, they are also relatively, there's been more terrorist attacks there as of late, peaceful, prosperous, and democratic. The western part of the country and Istanbul is very westernized and mostly secular. It's a little bit more conservative and religious in the rural areas. And they serve as a buffer for that instability that's happening in the south for Europe, although they have taken in quite a few refugees since the Syrian refugee crisis. But now there's kind of growing authoritarianism in the country, Islamism is growing. So it's certainly going to be a country to watch. But these kind of growing authoritarian regimes that are happening in this region and also calls for them in Europe and other parts of the world as well, they are certainly susceptible to that trend. So you can see here a map. Here's the country of Turkey. Here's Istanbul, which the Bosphorus River goes right across uh, from the Black Sea over, and so kind of divides Europe from the Middle East and then on to North Africa. But you can also see here, here's Syria. Turkey has taken in many refugees from the Syrian civil war. The economy of the region is largely based off of one thing, and that is oil. Oil is kind of the big marker, as I said before, of whether or not you have wealth in the region or whether or not you're pretty poor in the region. Oil lines and oil wealth really drive this region. So there's two types. The haves who have oil. One is monarchies who have oil. Um, and generally speaking, they're very wealthy, but they also share that wealth with their citizens. And then there are kleptocracies, where you have less developed countries that have oil, um, that are potentially unstable. And then with the have-nots, those who do not have oil, you generally have two types. You have less developed countries that rely on low-value trade or agriculture. And then you have Israel. Israel is kind of an outlier. It is a wealthy nation, but does not have oil. And so who has the oil globally? So each country here the is based upon the size of how much oil it has. So you can see United States, Canada, Venezuela has quite a bit of oil in South America, but really it is the Middle East that holds a very large part of oil. Also in sub-Saharan Africa, Nigeria has quite a bit of oil. But really the Middle East here is holding a lot of those oil reserves. And so we look at how oil wealth is distributed, right? We have rapid development in many cities. There's pictures there of Kuwait and the city of Dubai, which has expanded and developed very rapidly. Um, in countries like Iraq and Libya, they have historically had a kleptocracy where you have authoritarian rulers who are really extracting that oil money and that wealth for the elites of the country. Saudi Arabia, Kuwait, the United Arab Emirates, Qatar, Oman, and Bahrain, they are monarchies. And they invest their profits back into their country, generally speaking. And so the citizens see the benefits of this oil money. And lots of branding with oil money, so really kind of making your cities and your country stand out. And attempts at diversifying their economies because they recognize that this oil wealth is not going to last forever. When we get to South America, we'll talk a lot about Venezuela and kind of what has happened to their economy due to their dependence upon oil. But these countries recognize that, the price of oil can be volatile and that their oil is not going to last forever, so they need to diversify their economy. You're going to watch a video about Qatar and the 2022 World Cup after this lecture. And you can see this is a very small country with a ton of oil money, but they won the World Cup for 2022, and so they're building stadiums. And because they're a very small country and most of the citizens are fairly well off, they really are not interested in doing manual labor. So they've had all kinds of problems with, basically having people come from other countries to build these stadiums and living in very poor conditions, having their passports taken away, and basically living in kind of a indentured servitude. And so when we look at some of the social effects of oil from that, you can see Qatar here, right? If we look at our population bubble, lots of men have come into the country who are working age in order to help develop um, those stadiums, but also generally in these countries just to do construction, right? When you have countries where most of the citizens are, wealthy or well off, they're not very interested in doing construction jobs. So you have some immense personal wealth in these countries, lots of labor needed for construction and for service jobs. And so you get migration, mostly young men from South and Southeast Asia who are coming into this region for these jobs. And again, you're going to watch a video about some of the human rights abuses in Qatar. There has been over 1,000 deaths so far in the building of these stadiums for the World Cup. And again, you can get some kind of crazy things like in Dubai, right? Nobody is outrunning the police here. They're very well funded and they're driving around in Lamborghinis. Oil can also be a geopolitical issue, right? Oil is power in the region. Both Iraq wars were at least partly fought about oil. And you have OPEC, which is the Organization of Petroleum Exporting Countries, which most of these nations belong to, and they control the production, exportation, and therefore price of oil. And they can impose oil embargoes. So they really can control the market quite a bit. And so part of what we hear in this country about, switching to renewables or even drilling in the Arctic, it's all about, energy independence. Instability can cause ripples in the global economy since everybody um, pretty much is dependent upon oil. Um, and so when you look at Middle East oil fields and pipelines, right, you can see how the civil war in Syria would have disrupted a lot of oil in several pipelines. There's concerns in unstable parts of Syria and Iraq that basically, terrorist organizations can benefit from oil, but you have the potential for these large pipelines to get cut off. So this oil either needs to get out to the Persian Gulf or the Mediterranean Sea in order to reach that larger global market. And so you have all these kind of choke points um, that all of this oil is passing through. And the other thing in the region, we talked about how water is very scarce. And so, much like oil, you can have hydropolitics, which are fights over water. And so, we can see here, here's the Mosul Dam, um, which, if you're in a war zone, you certainly want to be able to control the water supply and control the dam. So the problem one here is that the region is very dry, so water is very important. Oil-rich companies pay for desalination, which is basically taking ocean water, removing the salts. So you have some drinking water, and then you release saltier water back out into the ocean. It is very fossil fuel heavy and very expensive to do. Problem number two is that rivers can cross over borders. So you need to have some type of cross-border cooperation, but also upstream areas will have leverage over downstream areas. Problem number three, aquifers cross borders, and that's these underground storages of water. And problem number four, the lack of stability in the area makes cooperation rare. So fighting over water can be much more common. And so we can have issues with water, such as with Israel and Palestine, with Israel controlling um, a lot of the fresh water and not necessarily giving enough to the Palestinian people. Or if you look at this huge aquifer that was under Saudi Arabia, this is mostly gone now. And basically, these countries are now relying on desal, which again is very, very expensive. So that's the end of our section on the Middle East. You're going to move on now and watch that video about the 2022 World Cup in Qatar.